Welcome back to the Our View podcast. On today's episode, I welcome my guest, Dr. Manisha Rayavarapu. Join our conversation as she tells us what it is like being a patient doctor and her experience of living with lupus. Welcome everyone back to another episode of the Our View podcast, where we aim to raise awareness, educate, and change the tone of conversation about disabilities. I am very happy to welcome my guest today, Dr. Manisha Rayavarapu, and we are looking forward to a very educational and informative conversation today. So, Dr. Manisha, thank you for joining me on the podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me, Art. It's a pleasure to be here.
Like a lot of my guests on my podcast recently, you and I met through Clubhouse, and you sent me a DM and you shared some of your story with me. And right away, I knew we had to connect to have you as a guest on the podcast. So I'm really happy that we were able to make this happen. I always kick off my podcast episodes by asking my guests to introduce themselves. So can you introduce yourself and tell our listeners who is Dr. Manisha?
Okay, so Dr. Manisha is a family medicine physician and author of the book Butterflies, Boards, and Blessings, A Doctor's Journey to Thriving with Lupus, and a lupus warrior and advocate. But I'm also a lot of other things. I'm a mom and a wife. I'm a Christian and I am an avid bird lover.
That is so cool that you mentioned that you love birds. That's why I love asking my guests to introduce themselves, because I always love what they choose to tell. I love birds as well, and I find myself just looking and seeing different types of birds and wondering, wow, I wonder what that is. I have a red-tailed hawk tattooed on my left shoulder in memory of my dad, because he loved red-tailed hawks for some reason. I don't know if I ever understood his reasoning for loving red-tailed hawks, but it's something that I always remember about him, and I think that's where it really got me into loving birds as well.
Own a parrot, and I just hatched some chickens over the weekend. So I have 11 little chickies in my house right now.
I've always looked up to people who have birds as pets, because especially parrots, I know they can live for 50 or more years. And I'm just not cut out for that type of dedication right now in my life. So that's really cool that you have a parrot and all of those new chickens. So in your introduction, you mentioned that you have lupus. Can you tell our listeners what lupus is and how it impacts your life?
Okay, so lupus is a chronic autoimmune disease. It is chronic, meaning that it is something I'm going to have lifelong and that there's no cure for it. And then autoimmune basically means that my immune system attacks normal, healthy cells and tissues in my body. The immune system doesn't recognize the normal tissues and cells and starts attacking this. And this causes pain, it causes inflammation and swelling, and can also cause damage in the organs. Now, there are a few different kinds of lupus. I have systemic lupus. It's called SLE, systemic erythematosus, systemic lupus erythematosus. And that being systemic means that it can affect any body system, any body organ in the body. And the most common ones usually are the skin and the joints. And in the skin, it can cause rashes, sun sensitivity, and then in the joints, usually pain, swelling. And then it can affect other parts of the body, the lungs, the heart, the kidneys is one of the major things that it can affect and can cause really serious kidney damage. It's called lupus nephritis. So it really can attack any part of your body. And For me, it has been mostly the joint pain, and I'd had some lung complications called pleuritis. So and skin. I get the classic what is called malar rash, which is a butterfly rash across my nose and cheeks. So lupus also can cause a lot of fatigue in addition to joint pain and a lot of body ache. So the way it's impacted my life is it has made it a lot harder to do the things that I normally do. There are days when I wake up and I am so exhausted. It feels like I didn't sleep at all. Or there are days when I am so stiff or so achy that it takes me 30 minutes of just kind of stretching in bed before I can actually get out of bed. Or there are days that I am in so much pain, and thankfully not recently. Um, but I have had days where I've been in so much pain that I can't move my body or anything touches my body. A t-shirt, a blanket, anything rubs against my body and it causes searing pain. If you can imagine having fatigue and pain like that, it affects every aspect of your life. It affects your ability to work and your career, which, it caused me to have to go part-time. It affects your relationships because people don't always understand when you don't want to go out or hang out with them. You can't stay out late. It affects your relationships, with your partners too. All of a sudden, your boyfriend or your husband, they become kind of a caregiver to you. So it really affects kind of every single aspect of your life.
That is something that so many of my other guests have said on the podcast, and I can also say it's true for me, how our disability impacts so many different areas of our lives, that areas of our life where people, without these diagnoses, they would have no idea of how it truly does impact us on a daily basis. Let me thank you for the work that you do as a doctor, because doctors have definitely improved my quality of life. And I just have such respect for doctors and the work that you do. You mentioned earlier in the conversation that you had to go part time in your practice as a doctor because of your lupus diagnosis. Can you talk about any other adjustments you have had to make uh, to your practice of being a doctor because of your lupus diagnosis?
So the biggest challenges that I dealt with in my career, number one, other than, just being very tired and, having the fatigue every day, and, not having to go part-time, I also struggled with having to keep it a secret, because it is not always looked on very kindly. Doctors are expected to be strong. We're expected not to get sick. We're expected to be there. And, when it comes to hiring a physician, you don't want someone who's going to be calling out. Um, and the same thing goes with, your colleagues. Your colleagues don't want someone who's going to be sick and having to cover you. So I kept my disease a secret, from my employers, from um, my colleagues, from my staff because of that. So those were some of the things that I had to learn to adapt with. Um, but I think lupus affected me in a positive way too. It definitely made me a better doctor. I feel like it made me more empathetic. Um, I now had a much deeper understanding of what a patient goes through, like full circle, everything that a patient goes through, not just that they're feeling sick or they're hurting or they're in pain, but also the social aspects that they're dealing with, the struggle of trying to get medications covered and paying for medications, um, the struggles of trying to get that medication shipped to you, dealing with insurance companies, trying to fit doctor's appointments and blood work and everything into your life and your job and making it all work. Um, so it really did teach me a lot of empathy. And I do feel also that it made me more competent, in that I do feel that I became more of a detective. I started asking more questions to my patients instead of just kind of assuming that it was related to you're not getting enough sleep or you worked out too hard or maybe it's something else. I really made me more question things more and kind of dig into things a little bit deeper.
I know for myself, having my disability all of my life and having been in and out of the hospital and to different doctor's appointments for different things, I have experienced times with the doctors where, I feel like they were kind of disconnected and I was just another patient to them. So I can really appreciate, what you're saying, that you being a doctor and also a patient, having your lupus diagnosis, I think that helps add another level of empathy for the patients that you serve. And, hopefully that helps your colleagues understand a little bit better as well, having such a close relationship with you of what people who live with lupus, what they experience on a daily basis. I am a true believer that one way that we can change the things in the world, and especially one thing that I'm passionate about, is changing the tone of conversation about disabilities, is by telling our stories. So, in your introduction, you mentioned that you wrote a book. So, can you tell us what your book is called, what it's about, and where everyone can purchase it?
Yes, my book is titled Butterflies, Boards, and Blessings, A Doctor's Journey to Thriving with Lupus. And basically, it talks about my journey becoming a doctor, the things that I had to deal with, the things that I learned as a physician, being both a physician and a patient. Um, and it talks about the process of becoming a doctor. It talks about the process of my diagnosis and coming to terms with my disease. I talk a lot also about my relationships and how lupus affected my relationship with my now husband, and how it affected the relationships with my family and with my friends. I also talk about how lupus affected my faith and my beliefs, because that's a big part of my life too. And what got me through the diagnosis and through the ups and downs of this journey is the support of my husband and of my friends and my loved ones, even if they didn't understand their support, and also my faith. These are the things that got me through my disease, um, and continue to get me through my disease on a daily basis. So I talk a lot about all of that in my book. And I wrote it because I really wanted people who are struggling with a chronic illness or any illness or anything in their life to feel encouraged that they can overcome, that with strength, with resilience, they can overcome anything. And it may not always look the way you think it's going to look. Your life isn't exactly going to be what you thought it would be, but you can still really have a great life, um, and a successful life. So that's one of the reasons I wrote that. We were talking about how lupus impacted my work. Well, with COVID going on right now, and with me being a family medicine physician, and also just recently having a child, who's, he's only 20 months now. With all of that, I had to make the decision to stay out of work because as a family medicine physician, I would be really in the front lines of COVID testing and seeing patients with COVID. I'm on immunosuppressants, and it would just be a great risk for me to take health wise, and also a great risk for my son, who's a young baby. So I made the decision to stay out of work. because of that. So, but I'm doing something else. I published a book. So, um, my life is not going exactly the way I thought it would be, but I'm still living a successful and fulfilling life. And that's what I wanted to get that message across in my book. And I also wanted to have a book that the friends and family members, the coworkers, could read and be able to read this and have a kind of a deeper, better understanding of what life with a chronic illness is like, to help them understand their loved ones who are living with a chronic illness.
We touched on it earlier when we were saying how our disability impacts our life on a daily basis, and how no matter how close the person may be to you, whether it's a family member or a friend, they still cannot fully understand what we go through as people who live with these diagnoses. And I think you writing this book and saying that you wrote it for your family and your friends, it's really important that we do share our stories with others, and especially those, like I said, who are closest to us, who know us very well, but still don't know those really deep down secrets that we hold, and the pain that we might feel, and the discomfort, and the exhaustion, and all of that that comes along with our diagnosis. So it's really great that you have decided to write your story and share it with everybody. Can you share with us one thing that you have found that people most misunderstand about lupus?
Oh, wow. So much is misunderstood about lupus. But some of the bigger things is that we don't always look sick. So they don't understand that just because we don't look sick doesn't mean that we're not sick. We can be very, very sick and it will never show. And so they misunderstand that, we look healthy, we look young, we look great, and they misunderstand and don't realize that really deep down inside we're in pain, or we are just fighting to stay awake that day. So that's one of the big things that's misunderstood. And the other thing that's misunderstood is that lupus is different for everyone. Um, just because, a lot of them will say, oh, well, my aunt has lupus and she's fine and she was able to have children and she was able to do this, that, and the other, but it's different for everyone. So that's another thing that's misunderstood a lot about lupus.
That is such an important thing to always remember, that every body is truly different. Just because you might know someone who has lupus, it may impact their body differently than the next person you meet who has lupus. Just as with my diagnosis of spina bifida, I'm able to walk. There are some people with spina bifida who are not able to walk. And it doesn't mean that that I don't have spina bifida, or they don't have spina bifida. It's just that the diagnosis truly impacts everybody in a different way, and that's something that we all have to be mindful of, and be cautious of, and just how we respond. It's just a way that we have to be aware of the way that we respond to those types of things. That's really important to remember. Dr. Manisha, I thank you so much for your time today and for all of the great information you shared. I know I learned a lot about lupus, and I'm sure there are many listeners who learned information as well. And before we end our conversation, can you just share with everyone where they are able to purchase your book?
Yes. So my book is available on Amazon as a paperback book and as Kindle. It's also available on Barnes and Noble, Kobo, I believe a couple of the other online bookstores. You can also get it from my website, which is www.thepatientdoc.com. And I just want to let everyone know that I'm always open for questions, or I love to meet new people. So if anybody would love to chat or just to DM me or ask me any questions, I would love that. And they can reach me on my website, The Patient Doc, or on Instagram at Manisha Rayavarapu.
Dr. Manisha, I'm so glad that we were able to connect, and I thank you so much for your time and for sharing your story. And I look forward to talking with you soon and working with you again in the future.
Art, thank you so much for having me. It was really nice uh, getting to speak with you finally. Uh,
Yes.
and it was really nice being here with you and talking to you.